Did you know that Everton was one of the 12 founding members of the Football League in 1888? They've been at the heart of English football ever since, spending more seasons in the top flight than any other club. But before we get into their history, let's talk about how it all began. Everton started as St. Domingo's FC, a small team formed to give people from a local church something to do in their free time. Just a year later, they changed their name to Everton, and that's when the journey really began. We'll get to their early years soon. But what makes Everton Football Club one of the most enduring names in football? Is it the iconic blue shirts, the roar of Goodison Park on match day, or the sheer determination that's seen them defy the odds time and again? Whatever it is, Everton's story is one of grit, glory, and resilience, a tale spanning nearly 150 years that we're about to uncover. 150 years of competing in the top flight. Unbelievable. Now, you might think that we're overemphasizing their glory, right? I mean, considering their recent run, it's quite obvious. But hey, sit tight. The mid-1960s and 80s will blow your mind and change your perspective on Everton. Before getting into their triumphs, first, let's talk about the fact that Everton has only been relegated twice in their entire history, which is remarkable when you think about how unpredictable football can be. But it's not just about survival, it's about ambition. From their early league titles to becoming the first English club to build a purpose-built stadium, Everton has always aimed high. And speaking of Goodison Park, before we get to its future, let's reflect on its role in shaping the club. Since moving there in 1892, it's been their home for over a century, a place where countless memories have been made. But as times change, so does football. Soon, Everton will leave Goodison behind for a new chapter, and that's a story we'll dive into later. So, what makes Everton special? Is it their history, their resilience, or their connection to the fans? Stick around as we explore every twist and turn of this club's incredible journey, from the glory days to their current challenges. Let's get started. To truly understand Everton Football Club, we need to go back to where it all began, 1878. At the time, football wasn't the global phenomenon it is today. It was a simple game played in local parks, and Everton's roots were no different. You already know that the club started as St. Domingo's FC, created by members of St. Domingo's Methodist Church in Liverpool. The idea was simple: give the church's community something to do outside of sermons. Football became the perfect outlet. Just a year later, in 1879, the team decided to adopt a name that represented more than the church. It represented the area they were part of. And so, Everton Football Club was born. Back then, football was still taking shape. There were no professional leagues, no big stadiums, and certainly no multi-million-pound transfers. But Everton quickly made a name for themselves. By the 1880s, they were competing in local competitions and building a reputation as one of the strongest teams in the region. Here's a fun fact: Everton's early nickname was the Black Watch because of their dark kits. These kits weren't just for style, they were a reflection of how the game was played back then: tough, physical, and anything but glamorous. In 1888, everything changed for English football. The Football League was formed, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And guess who was there right from the start? That's right, Everton. By this point, Everton had already shown that they were more than just a local team. They were ambitious, determined to make their mark. Little did they know this was only the beginning of a story that would stretch for generations. But before we get to their first taste of glory, let's talk about one of the most pivotal moves in their history: their decision to leave a famous ground for a new home. Trust me, it's a story that shaped not just Everton, but all of English football. Success in football doesn't come without drama, and for Everton, it all started with a split that changed everything. Did you know Everton originally played their home games at Anfield? Yes, that Anfield. But in 1892, a dispute over rent with the ground's owner, John Holding, forced the club to move out. Holding went on to form a new team. You might have heard of them, Liverpool FC. We've talked about the split and the entire history of Liverpool in another video. Don't forget to check that out. Meanwhile, Everton settled at a new home just a mile away, Goodison Park. It was the first purpose-built football stadium in England, and it quickly became the heart of the club. Just 3 years later, in 1891, Everton tasted glory for the first time. They won their first league title, finishing ahead of Preston North End in a hard-fought season. This wasn't just a trophy, it was a statement. Everton wasn't here to make up the numbers, they were here to win. The game was growing fast, but it wasn't without its challenges. The early 1900s were a mix of highs and lows for Everton. They reached their first FA Cup final in 1893, but lost to Wolverhampton Wanderers. It wasn't until 1906 that they finally lifted the famous trophy, beating Newcastle United in front of over 75,000 fans. And then came World War I. Like all clubs, Everton's momentum was brought to a halt. Still, one thing was clear. Everton had already established themselves as one of the top clubs in England. With the league title, an FA Cup, and a stadium that set the standard for the future, they were ready to build on their early success. What came next was a golden age for the club, fueled by one of the greatest goal scorers the game has ever seen. Stay tuned, because we're about to meet the man who changed everything, Dixie Dean. But before we get to him, let's talk about where Everton stood after the war. By the early 1920s, the club was rebuilding, trying to recapture the success they'd tasted before the war. In 1928, that rebuilding effort paid off in spectacular fashion. Everton won their second league title, but this wasn't just any league-winning season. This was the year Dixie Dean wrote his name into the history books. You've probably heard the name Dixie Dean before, but let me paint the picture. Dean was a forward who could score goals like nobody else. And in the 1927-28 season, he didn't just score a lot. He scored 60 goals in 39 league games. Yes, 60. That record hasn't been broken since, and honestly, it probably never will. Dean wasn't just a player, he was a phenomenon, and he made Everton one of the most feared teams in the country. Just 5 years later, in 1933, Everton added another trophy to their cabinet, the FA Cup. They defeated Manchester City 3-0 in the final, with Dean, as always, leading the charge. But football isn't just about trophies, it's also about moments. One of those moments came in 1938 when Goodison Park hosted England's first ever World Cup qualifier. It was a sign of how important the stadium had become, not just to Everton, but to football as a whole. By the end of the 1930s, Everton had won 5 major trophies, solidifying their place as one of England's top clubs. But just as they were hitting their stride, the world changed again. World War II put football on hold, and once more, Everton would have to pick up the pieces after the fighting stopped. Still, the legacy of the interwar years was undeniable. With players like Dixie Dean and trophies to back it up, Everton had set a standard for success. The question was, could they keep it going in a world that was changing faster than ever before? When World War II ended in 1945, football made its long-awaited return. But for Everton, the post-war years were anything but smooth. Before the war, Everton had been league champions in 1939, but the conflict meant that they didn't get the chance to defend their title. By the time football resumed, the team was a shadow of its former self. Players had aged, others had moved on, and rebuilding was no easy task. The 1940s and early 1950s were marked by one of Everton's rare low points. In 1951, the unthinkable happened. Everton were relegated from the First Division for the first time in their history. For a club with such a proud tradition, it was a bitter pill to swallow. But it took just 3 years for the Toffees to fight their way back to the top flight, earning promotion in 1954. Their return to the First Division was a sign that Everton wasn't a club that stayed down for long. Despite their return, the club struggled to find the consistency needed to challenge for silverware. Managers came and went, and Everton often found themselves mid-table, far from the glory days of the 1920s and 1930s. However, even in this period of struggle, Goodison Park remained a constant. It was a place of hope, even when results didn't go their way. By the end of the 1950s, change was on the horizon. Everton had laid the groundwork for a brighter future, and a new generation of players and managers were ready to step up. And bounce back they did. The 1960s would bring a golden era to Goodison Park, filled with league titles, FA Cups, and some of the most iconic players in the club's history. But before we dive into that success, let's take a closer look at the man who would guide them to glory, Harry Catterick. If you're an Everton fan, the 1960s might just be your favorite decade. After years of struggle and mid-table mediocrity, the club entered a golden era under the leadership of Harry Catterick. Let's talk about Catterick himself. Appointed as manager in 1961, he wasn't the loudest or flashiest figure in football, but he had a sharp footballing mind and a vision for what Everton could be. He believed in building a team that could dominate not just for a season, but for years to come. And dominate they did. Catterick's revolution began in the transfer market. He brought in some incredible talent, including Alex Young, known as the Golden Vision. If you've never heard of him, just imagine a player who could glide past defenders like they weren't even there. Fans adored him, and rightly so. The transformation was quick. In 1963, just 2 years after Catterick's arrival, Everton won the First Division title. They finished 6 points clear at the top, playing some of the most exciting football in the country. It was Everton's first league title in 24 years, a moment of pure joy for the fans who had waited so long. But Everton wasn't done. The 1966 FA Cup final is still one of the most iconic moments in the club's history. Facing Sheffield Wednesday at Wembley, Everton found themselves 2-0 down. It looked like the game was slipping away, but then came one of the greatest comebacks of all time. Everton roared back to win 3-2, with goals from Mike Treblecock and Derek Temple. Can you imagine the scenes? The blue half of Merseyside erupted in celebration. And let's not forget, 1966 wasn't just a big year for Everton. It was the year England won the World Cup. Goodison Park played a starring role, hosting 5 matches during the tournament, including the legendary quarter-final between Portugal and North Korea. By the end of the decade, Everton had cemented their place as one of England's top clubs. In 1970, they won yet another league title, finishing 9 points clear of Leeds United. This wasn't just the team, it was a dynasty in the making. Players like Alan Ball, Howard Kendall, and Colin Harvey formed the Holy Trinity, a midfield trio that could outplay anyone. Under Catterick, Everton became the school of science, playing beautiful football that left fans in awe. But, as football often reminds us, glory doesn't last forever. The 1970s would bring new challenges for the club, and the golden era would give way to a period of transition. Still, the legacy of the 1960s lives on. Ask any Evertonian about that decade, and you'll see their eyes light up. So, what happened when the 1970s rolled around? Let's dive into the next chapter of Everton's story, where the highs and lows came thick and fast. As the 1970s dawned, football, like life, reminded Evertonians of one simple truth: nothing stays golden forever. The decade began with promise. Everton had just won the league in 1970, finishing as one of the most dominant teams in England. Just a year after lifting the title, cracks began to show. Alan Ball, one of the most beloved players in Everton's history, was sold to Arsenal in 1971. The transfer sent shockwaves through the fan base. How do you replace a player like that? The answer was, they didn't. The rest of the 1970s became a period of frustration. Everton struggled to find the consistency that had defined their golden era. The team hovered around mid-table for much of the decade, and while there were occasional glimpses of promise, they couldn't quite recapture the magic of the previous years. One of the biggest heartbreaks came in 1977 in the League Cup final against Aston Villa. It took 3 matches to decide a winner. Yes, 3. After 2 replays, Villa finally came out on top. For Evertonians, it was a bitter pill to swallow. So close, yet so far. But if you think this is a story of decline, think again, because Everton is a club that never stays down for long. Let me take you back to the early 1980s. It wasn't all sunshine for Everton. The late 70s had been tough. But then came Howard Kendall, a man who knew what Everton meant, not just a football club, but a family, a history, a heartbeat of Merseyside. His appointment as manager in 1981 wasn't universally celebrated, but what followed, well, it would etch his name into Evertonian folklore forever. At first, Kendall's reign didn't go smoothly. The early 1980s were tough, and some fans even questioned whether he was the right man for the job. But little did they know, Kendall was building something special. Behind the scenes, he was assembling a team that would become one of the greatest in Everton's history. And then, in 1984, the tide finally turned. Everton reached the FA Cup final against Graham Taylor's Watford. For a team desperate to break their trophy drought, this was a moment to seize, and seize it they did. Graham Sharp and Andy Gray scored the goals that secured a 2-0 victory, and just like that, Everton were back. That FA Cup win wasn't just a trophy, it was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a new era, one that would see Everton rise to heights they hadn't reached in decades. But before we dive into the glory of the mid-1980s, take a moment to reflect. This is what makes Everton special. No matter how tough the times get, this club always finds a way to bounce back. Now, are you ready to hear about one of the most dominant Everton sides of all time? The mid-1980s are calling, and trust me, it's a story you won't want to miss. After the FA Cup win in 1984, Howard Kendall's vision truly started to take shape. The Toffees weren't just back, they were the team to beat, a force of nature in English football. Kendall didn't just rebuild the squad, he rebuilt the spirit. And then came 1985, the year that every Evertonian dreams about. Kendall had turned his team into a well-oiled machine, with legends like Neville Southall, Kevin Ratcliffe, and Graham Sharp leading the charge. They didn't just win the league, they dominated it, finishing 13 points clear of second place. Oh, and let's not forget that magical European Cup Winners' Cup campaign. The semi-final against Bayern Munich, if you were there, you'll never forget it. Trailing 1-0 from the first leg, Everton roared back at Goodison with a 3-1 win that was pure electricity. They went on to beat Rapid Vienna in the final, securing their first ever European trophy. Of course, the mid-1980s wasn't without its heartbreak. The 1986 season stung. Everton were so close to back-to-back league titles only to lose out to Liverpool on the final day. And then there was the 1986 FA Cup final, a Merseyside derby at Wembley. Liverpool took that one too, and if you're an Everton fan, you probably still grimace at the memory. But what came next? Redemption. The 1986-87 season was Everton's second league title in 3 years. Kendall had done it again, proving that his side wasn't just great, they were one of the greatest in English football history. By the time Kendall left in 1987, Everton were riding high. Sure, there were challenges ahead, but this era cemented their place as one of football's true giants. Now, here's a question for you. What's your favorite memory of the Kendall years? Is it Southall's stunning saves, Sharp's unforgettable goals, or the sheer joy of watching a team that could take on anyone? Let me know in the comments, because we're about to head into the next chapter, the challenges of the 1990s. Trust me, it's a roller coaster you won't want to miss. The early 2000s were a crossroads for Everton. After years of flirting with relegation and uncertainty, the club desperately needed stability. Enter David Moyes. When he walked through the Goodison doors in March 2002, he famously declared Everton as the People's Club. It wasn't just a soundbite, it was a rallying cry for a fan base hungry for pride and purpose. Moyes didn't waste time. In his first full season, he guided Everton to an impressive 7th place finish, a far cry from the relegation scraps of the 1990s. It wasn't flashy, but Moyes brought organization, grit, and a belief that Everton could punch above their weight. The 2004-05 season was the true breakthrough. Despite losing Wayne Rooney, Everton's prodigal son, to Manchester United, Moyes' side defied expectations, finishing 4th and qualifying for the Champions League. It felt like the club was finally dreaming big again. Players like Tim Cahill, a tireless midfield dynamo, and Mikel Arteta, with his elegance and creativity, became modern-day legends. But competing with the financial giants of the Premier League was never easy. Moyes had to work miracles on a tight budget, and while Everton never broke into the elite, they consistently punched above their weight. Top half finishes, a Europa League run, and an unforgettable FA Cup final in 2009. Yes, they lost to Chelsea, but Evertonians will never forget Louis Saha's goal just 25 seconds in, a moment of pure magic. Moyes' era was far from perfect. There were disappointments in the cups and frustrations over the lack of investment, but he restored pride, discipline, and identity to a club that had been drifting. Evertonians believed again, and when Moyes departed for Manchester United in 2013, he left behind a team and a fan base that felt ready to dream once more. What's your best memory of the Moyes era? Is it the Cahill celebrations, Arteta's genius, or that miraculous fourth-place finish? Let us know, because next we'll dive into the highs and lows of the modern era, where big money signings met the unrelenting pressure of the Premier League. It's a story you don't want to miss. If the Moyes era was about stability, the years that followed have been anything but. The club entered the Farhad Moshiri era in 2016 with big ambitions and even bigger spending. Names like Gylfi Sigurdsson, Richarlison, and James Rodriguez were brought in for eye-watering fees. On paper, Everton were building a team to challenge the Premier League's elite. But football isn't played on paper, and for Everton, the reality has been a roller coaster. Roberto Martinez kicked off the post-Moyes era with promise. His first season saw Everton finish 5th, their best league position since 2005. But Martinez's flair-focused philosophy soon fell apart, and his sacking in 2016 marked the beginning of a revolving door of managers. Ronald Koeman, Sam Allardyce, Marco Silva, Carlo Ancelotti, each brought their own ideas, but none could find lasting success. The inconsistency wasn't just on the touchline. For every exciting signing, there seemed to be an equal number of missteps. Players came and went, but the chemistry never quite clicked. Even under a world-class manager like Ancelotti, Everton's performances veered between flashes of brilliance and head-scratching mediocrity. And then there were the relegation battles, scars that no Evertonian ever expected to face. The 2021-22 season was the lowest point yet. Under Frank Lampard, Everton teetered on the brink, and survival came down to the wire. Remember that electric night against Crystal Palace? 2-0 down, and somehow they turned it around to win 3-2. Dominic Calvert-Lewin's diving header will go down as one of the most emotional moments in recent Goodison history. Everton somehow finished 16th in the league, thanks to Richarlison's 10 goals. But the 2022-23 season was worse, a campaign that was nothing short of a nail-biter. Frank Lampard couldn't steady the ship, and by January, Everton found themselves staring into the abyss of relegation. Enter Sean Dyche, a no-nonsense manager who knew how to fight when it mattered most. The turning point? A tense final day against Bournemouth. The atmosphere at Goodison was suffocating, the stakes immeasurable. Then came that Dwight McNeil goal, a simple strike, but one that carried the weight of an entire fan base. With a 1-0 victory, Everton clung to their Premier League status by the skin of their teeth. Relief poured through the terraces, but deep down, everyone knew the struggles weren't over. The 2023-24 season brought fresh turmoil. Points deductions for financial breaches became the club's new nightmare, docking them 8 points in total after appeals. Ownership upheavals left fans wondering who truly held the reins, and while the team fought hard, finishing 15th in the league, the season felt anything but secure. Even in the chaos, there were glimmers of fight, like their EFL Cup run to the quarterfinals and Dominic Calvert-Lewin's 7 league goals offering faint hope. But it wasn't enough. In the first week of this new year, Sean Dyche was shown the door, leaving the team still stuck in 16th place. Everton were desperate for a savior, and who better than a man who already knew what it meant to bleed blue? David Moyes returned, a familiar face who brought with him a promise of rebuilding, not just the squad, but the faith of the fans. Can Moyes, the man who once made Everton dream, pull them out of the quicksand and set them back on the path to glory? Can the likes of Dwight McNeil and Iliman Ndiaye rise to the challenge and provide the spark the team so desperately needs? The questions linger, but one thing is clear. Evertonians have never stopped believing. The return of Moyes feels like a second chance, a chance to write a new chapter in a story that's far from over. Goodison Park, as always, has been the constant. The fans have remained the soul of the club, unwavering even in the darkest times. And now, as Everton prepare to leave their historic home for the new Bramley Moore Dock Stadium, there's a bittersweet sense of transition. But what lies ahead? Can Everton rebuild, reclaim their identity, and rise again? Only time will tell. Stick around, because next we'll take a deep dive into Goodison Park itself, the fortress, the memories, and the heartbeat of Everton Football Club. Goodison Park isn't just a football stadium, it's a sacred ground, a second home, and the beating heart of Everton Football Club for over 130 years. Every brick, every blade of grass holds the memories of generations of Evertonians. It's where legends like Dixie Dean, Alan Ball, and Duncan Ferguson etched their names into history, and where the fans have carried their team through the highest highs and the lowest lows. Think of those nights under the Goodison lights, the roars that echoed through the blue half of Merseyside. Who could forget the 1984 European Cup Winners' Cup semi-final against Bayern Munich? The terraces shook as Everton came back to win 3-1, a performance as electric as the crowd. Or the Great Escape against Wimbledon in 1994, when Barry Horn's thunderbolt kept the club alive. And what about Crystal Palace in 2022? That incredible comeback felt like the spirit of Goodison itself dragging the team over the line. From hosting World Cup matches in 1966 to the weekly battles of the Merseyside Derby, it's where passion lives and breathes. The noise, the banners, the unforgettable Gladys Street end, it's all made Goodison a fortress that every Evertonian feels proud to call home. But now the chapter is coming to an end. With the move to Bramley Moore Dock Stadium looming, there's a bittersweet mix of excitement and heartbreak. Everton are stepping into the future, but how do you say goodbye to a place that feels like family? What's your favorite memory of Goodison Park? Let us know, because while the stadium may change, the memories of Goodison will live on forever. This isn't goodbye. From their humble beginnings as St. Domingo's FC to the glory years under Howard Kendall, and even through the heartbreaks of recent seasons, Everton has always stood for something bigger: resilience, loyalty, and an unshakable bond between the club and its fans. But here's the question every Evertonian is asking: what comes next? The move to Bramley Moore Dock Stadium is on the horizon, a symbol of ambition and a new chapter for the club. But can the magic of Goodison Park, the roars, the drama, the memories, truly be replicated? As Everton steps into this brave new era, the challenges ahead are immense. Financial struggles, managerial instability, and the ever-widening gap between the Premier League's elite and the rest leave no room for error. Yet, if history has taught us anything, it's that Evertonians never stop believing. Remember Wimbledon in '94, Coventry in '98, Crystal Palace in 2022? Time and time again, when the odds have been stacked against them, this club has fought back. So here's my challenge to you. What do you think the future holds for Everton? Will the People's Club rise again to challenge the best? Or will the struggle of recent years continue to weigh them down? Share your thoughts, your hopes, your fears, because every Everton fan has a voice in this story. One thing is certain: the story of Everton is far from over. And as we look to the future, let's never forget the past. And no matter what happens next, one thing will always be true: nil satis nisi optimum. What will the next chapter hold? Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure: we'll all be watching, cheering, and hoping, just like we always have. Up the Toffees! Hope you enjoyed the video. A subscription will help us make more amazing content for you.